Well, I'd like to welcome you, all of you, to the opening session of our symposium on the economic crisis and the common good, local and global dimensions. This is sponsored by the Villanova University Partnership with Catholic Relief Services. My name is Suzanne Toten. I'm a member of the Theology and Religious Studies Department and also coordinator of the university's partnership for the Office of Mission and Ministry. Catholic Relief Services is the official overseas humanitarian agency of the U.S. Catholic community. It alleviates suffering and provides assistance to people in need in more than 100 countries without regard to race, religion, or nationality. This spring marks the 5th anniversary of Villanova's institutional partnership with Catholic Relief. It's a partnership between a Catholic institution of higher learning and a Catholic international non-governmental organization. A partnership between teachers and scholars and emergency relief and development experts and their partner agencies overseas. In the Memorandum of Understanding signed in May 2005, both institutions, Villanova and CRS, agreed to collaborate in education, research, advocacy, and service for the purposes of strengthening each other's mission, building solidarity with the poor and marginalized in poor nations of the world, and contributing to the effort to build a more compassionate, just, and peaceful global order. Now to the work of this symposium. We tend to forget that the economic crisis we are in is a global crisis, and that while it is causing grave hardship here in the United States and suffering, it has life and death consequences in poor nations. This crisis, like other crises, we must believe presents opportunity, provided we are willing to ask tough questions. This afternoon, and our keynote speaker, William Greider, will help us with this. The question before us, as William Greider, this evening's keynote speaker, writes, is whether we will rise to the challenge and dare to envision and work toward a very different social order. I'd like to first introduce our speakers for this session, and the format will be that each speaker will speak for about 20 minutes, and then we'll take questions at the end. So our first speaker will be Dr. Maria Toyota. Maria Toyota is Associate Professor and Chairperson of the Political Science Department at Villanova. She's also Founding Director of East Asian Studies at Villanova. Her research and writing focus on the causal mechanisms of financial liberalization, the politics of development aid, the mobilization of postal savings and government financial institutions for policy financing in Japan, and banking and regulatory reform in Japan. She teaches undergraduate and graduate courses on East Asian politics, international relations, international and comparative political economy, and development aid. Her most recent research with Dennis Quinn was published in the American Journal of Political Science and the Review of Financial Studies. Dr. Toyota received her bachelor's degree in human biology with honors in values, technology, science, and society from Stanford University. And she received her PhD with distinction from Georgetown University. Dr. Toyota will be followed by Ms. Darette Little-Bird. Darette Little-Bird is the director of the Program Quality Support Department of Catholic Relief Services. In this capacity, she ensures the provision of technical assistance to over 100 country programs in emergency response, health, HIV and AIDS, agriculture, water and sanitation, education, microfinance, peacebuilding, partnership, and monitoring and evaluation. She also manages the implementation of the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, PEPFAR, funded antiretroviral therapy treatment project of over $525 million in 9 countries in Africa and the Caribbean. From 2000 to 2004, Ms. Bird served as Deputy Executive Director of CRS's overseas operations, where she provided policy and strategic guidance to CRS's operations worldwide, managing an annual portfolio of over $500 million and a staff of 3,500. From 1997 to 2000, she was country representative for CRS in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. She also served as CRS country representative in Dakar, Senegal from 1993 to 1997. Before joining CRS, Bird worked as a research specialist for the African Development Foundation. She was deputy director for the National Council of Negro Women, worked as a consultant for the African Development Foundation, and was the administrative financial officer for Africare in Niger, West Africa. And she worked as a research associate for the Center for Policy Research. Ms. Bird holds an MA in International Studies from the University of Denver, Colorado, and a BA from Brandeis University. Thank you very much. Maria?
Thank you, Sue. Let's see. What I'm going to try to do is fix this for just a minute here and see if resetting this will make sure that the entire screen shows up. There, does that any better?
Yes.
Okay, good. All right. What Dorit and I have been tasked to do today is to give the setting, the background for discussions that will take place in the breakout sections this afternoon and to lead up to William Greider's keynote talk this evening. And my specific task is to try and explain something that's really very complicated, very complex, which is what happened. Now, the problem is that that there have been a complex number of things that did occur that all came together in a particular way to create a very bad financial crisis. And I take it as my main task today to try and make this understandable to people. And so I will also say that we still don't really know what the root causes of this financial crisis are. It's still in dispute among many economists and many people who study financial economics. There are many papers out there looking at the root causes of this issue. And so what I'm going to say today is really nothing more than a pastiche of what the current scholarship on this issue is. But no doubt we will see a lot more coming in the months and years ahead. People are still trying to figure out what caused the Asian financial crisis, so this is going to take some time. Now, I will say that this is something of a chicken and an egg problem. What we're trying to do is try and identify some of the root causes that are being disputed currently by economists. But what I'll do is try and hedge my bets a little by saying that I'm going to talk about two broad strands. Right? The first strand that I'm going to talk about has to do with the systemic context. What were the global conditions that set the stage for what the second set of conditions are, which I'm going to talk about, which were some bad decisions made by government, by individuals, and by firms at the domestic level within the United States and within other developed, rich, industrialized countries, and how the confluence of these two things, the systemic and the domestic factors, led to the financial crisis in this country and elsewhere. So I'm going to start with talking a little bit about the systemic global context. I know I'm giving you whiplash. I'm going to try not to do that too often. The predominant theory out there right now about what was happening in the global financial environment is this problem of a global imbalance. Ben Bernanke himself, this is one of his pet theories, was basically asserting that elsewhere in the world there was a global savings glut. There was a global savings glut that meant that excess money around the world was chasing too few investment opportunities in the world. And this contributed to asset speculation. But this global imbalance hypothesis has a couple of problems. One of the things that we need to note, and I want you to look specifically at the dates past 2000 where I drew the yellow lines. Look at chart 3 first. One of the problems is that there doesn't seem to have been a global savings glut. It appears that there were some savings that increased in the developing countries. So if you look at the at chart 4, past 2000, you see some modest increases in savings, mainly among emerging market countries. But you'll also see that in the other chart, chart 3, among the rich countries, particularly the United States and Japan, there was no global savings glut. There was no increase in savings. In fact, there was a decline in both the United States and Japan in the level of savings that they had. So rich countries especially did not save, but poorer countries did save. And this did not lead to a global savings glut. There's another interesting thing. If you look at at these lines, if you look at the dashed lines in chart 3, you'll notice that those indicate the level of investment made by these countries, and you'll note that, that amongst the rich countries, there wasn't a whole lot of investment taking place. In fact, there was a decline in investment after the year 2000. Now, normally in a situation where you have savings looking for investment opportunities, you would see so let's say that these developing emerging market nations saved, you would expect those savings to come to the US, and you would expect that those savings would somehow be invested, but that's not what is taking place. So no savings glut, but certainly a real shift in terms of who is doing the saving and who is doing the investing. Developing countries are doing the savings. They're the ones also engaged in investment. Rich countries, particularly here in the United States, haven't been saving, and we, in addition to that, have not been investing as much. Now, the other question here is, why is it that developing countries have been saving so much in recent years, in the past decade? Here's one possibility. Now, the Asian financial crisis, which struck a lot of countries in developing countries in 1997, if you recall, one of the main features of that crisis was currency speculation. There were these attacks made on the currencies of many of these Asian countries. And if you recall, the way in which this was addressed were mainly through things like IMF bailouts, the International Monetary Fund, coming in and bailing out a lot of these countries, but also then putting into place programs that were conditional on certain performance issues. So in a lot of cases, this required countries to tighten their belts. It required austerity, and it required a lot of things that were very unpopular. And the IMF, which is, of course, a proxy for the United States, garnered a great deal of resentment in these countries as a result of the policies that were enacted in the aftermath of the Asian financial crisis. The savings that we were talking about is, in one sense, you could think of this as a defense mechanism or an insurance policy against future financial crises. What we see, this began all the way back before the Asian financial crisis, but we see a real acceleration in the accumulation of foreign reserves. Now, these are foreign reserves that emerging market countries have now in place that they can use as kind of a tool to combat any future currency crises. If someone begins to attack their currency, they now have the tools, they have now got the foreign reserves in order to fight off speculators. Now, so you'll see here that this is the growth in the percentage of foreign reserves, percentage as a part of GDP, that emerging market nations in particular have been accumulating over time. And you'll see that the rich countries, again, have not been doing much to increase their foreign reserves. But that in itself is not a problem. This brings us to talking about, to try to make the connection back from these global conditions of savings being shifted to emerging market nations, to investment being shifted out of the developing countries, to talking a little bit about how domestic factors tie into into the global context. And here I'm going to turn to talking a little bit about some very bad decisions, again, made by individuals, by firms, and by policymakers here in the United States, but also in Europe and other places, that led to the financial crisis. So if we take China in isolation, by the way, China and Japan are the two largest holders of foreign reserves in the world. Combined, they have something like $4 trillion worth of foreign reserves, and China is by far is the number one holder with over $2 trillion in foreign reserves. And much of those reserves go towards purchasing American sovereign debt. Usually this is in the form of US Treasury bonds and so forth. And why do they buy US Treasury bonds? It's the safest investment you can get, even if the returns are not very good. And in fact, they've been negative in terms of real interest rates for a long time. But it is considered a safe place to put this. It's not just the Chinese government, by the way, and it's not just the Japanese government, but it's places like pension funds or institutional investors that have to worry about putting their money into safe instruments. And so a lot of this money tends to go towards government securities. It also goes towards other government-guaranteed bonds. And here's a case in point. If you look specifically at, let me just switch over here, at where the Chinese government invested a lot of their foreign reserves and their savings. A lot of this money went into government-guaranteed corporations like Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. Now, these are two government-guaranteed corporations. They're independent they have shareholders and so forth, but they are backed up by government guarantees. And their sole purpose is to buy up mortgages in order to free up banks and other lenders so that they can continue to make additional mortgages. It basically takes these mortgages off their books. So when countries like China invest in Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae bonds, this is what they are facilitating. And this, I'm sure that some of you have seen this when the crisis was at a peak, was that a lot of the crisis was blamed on the creation of these exotic securities instruments. And in particular, this was driven by these investors around the world looking for safe instruments to put their money in. But it was also driven by, as I said, the growth of things like pension funds and investments made by insurance companies. So to meet the demands, investment bankers were obliged to create these derivatives. And in particular, one of the most commonly found derivatives out there was something called the collateralized debt obligation, or CDOs. And essentially what these are a pool of assets, of assets of different varying degrees of risk, and they are pooled together and they're sliced into tranches, and the highest levels tranches are presumably the safest, they're rated the highest, and then the subsequent tranches are of lower quality and therefore of higher risk. So an example of a CDO, and the one that should be the most familiar to most of you, is a mortgage-backed security, or an MBS. So this is actually an illustration of how you create one. First, you buy up a lot of mortgages, right? You buy them from banks, you buy them from mortgage companies, loan originators, and so forth. And then you pool them all together. That's where the red Monopoly hotel there is. You pull them all together, and this is what Fannie Mae does. This pool is then sliced into these tranches, depending on the level of risk, right? You can have a fairly low level of risk at the most senior level, and these tend to be rated the highest in terms of quality, and therefore you have a lower risk, and therefore your yields are lower. And these are the things that the institutional investors want to buy. This is what other governments, sovereign governments, want to buy, and so these are very much in demand. Investment banks got paid huge fees, enormous fees, in order to originate and sell these products. And so they would, at some point they started to run out of mortgages to buy, right? Let's say around mid-2000 they started to have to dig a little bit deeper to locate the mortgages that they could buy and then repackage. And then we got into the situation where you would have a CDO of CDOs, the CDO squared, and then you would have CDOs of CDOs of CDOs, which would be something like CDOs cubed. So these securities would be packaged, repackaged, sliced and diced and sold off. Meantime, there would be all sorts of origination fees and bankers' fees attached to it, and people were happy. They were making a lot of money off of these fees. Investors seemed to be happy because they thought they were holding low-risk securities. But when they had to start digging deeper to find the mortgages themselves in order to create these mortgage-backed securities, this is when they started to dig into subprime mortgages. And you'll see here that there was a huge increase in subprime mortgages. If you look at just from 2003 to 2007, the number of U.S. subprime mortgages increased almost 300%, the value from about $330 billion to over $1.3 trillion. And you can see where the trouble began, because then the underlying assets under these mortgage-backed securities are of poor quality, and the risk increases. The risk of default begins to increase. Now combine that with some very bad policy, right? I'm just going to give you one example of this bad policy. In 2004, the Securities Exchange Commission suspended the net capital rule for 5 firms, 3 of which don't exist anymore, right? The only 2 that are left are Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley. But in 2004, just a few years before this crisis really began to hit home, the SEC allowed these companies to leverage something on the ratio of 40-to-1, the debt that they could issue. In other words, for every $1 that they held in reserve, they could have $40 of debt outstanding. That's a tremendous ratio in terms of leverage. Further bad news was some inappropriate monetary policy. By the way, this part is probably the most disputed aspect of this argument, which is that the Federal Reserve under Alan Greenspan kept monetary policy too easy for too long. They kept the interest rates too low for too long. But the other part that isn't disputed is that the Federal Reserve engaged in inadequate regulation and supervision of banks. Ben Bernanke himself, in testimony to the Senate Banking Committee, had to acknowledge that the Federal Reserve had failed to tighten these underwriting standards, which could have helped avert the subprime crisis and the subsequent recession that followed. Now, with such low interest rates, this helped to create a real estate bubble, an asset bubble. And this isn't that different from the one that was created in Japan in the mid-1980s that subsequently led to its lost decade, which really is more something like the lost 2 decades. But the real imbalance here is that while other countries increased savings, we increased our consumption. And a case in point is here, that with this asset bubble, you look at the housing prices and the rise from about 2002 up until the end of 2006, when home prices were peaking. They were peaking at a relative increase in value of 20% by late 2006. Now you add that up with this. Chinese households have been steadily saving over time to the point where 25% of its disposable income, household savings as a percentage of its disposable income, has been rising. But if you look at savings in the United States and what happened since the mid-1990s, it's a much different picture. We see that household debt has been rapidly increasing, while the rate of savings has been dramatically falling. In other words, rather than an investment boom, an asset bubble was created, and this encouraged ordinary people to spend more and to save less. Now, if we add into this other factors such as incompetence, greed, bad borrowing decisions on the part of both investors and individuals, people who were treating their homes like ATMs, the availability of cheap money, the opportunities and many opportunities to make money in such a lax regulatory environment meant that basically if you added all of these together, it made for a good formula for crisis. New housing starts dropped dramatically starting in 2006. You can see here. We go back to the Case-Shiller Index, you'll see that housing prices began to fall in late 2005. And then a number of mortgage brokers, if you recall, mortgage brokers like Countrywide Financial and others of their ilk began to fail in large numbers by 2007. And so this is where it leaves us today. So I hope that was a good background as to the origins of the financial crisis. I'm going to now turn it over to Dorit, who can, I'll switch over to the, to her. Okay, you just need to hit this button, go back and forth with these 2 buttons.
So this one?
Yeah, that one or this one.
Okay, great. Thank you, Maria. And good afternoon, all of you, and welcome to this symposium. I am going to speak about what happened overseas in the countries where we work. And we work in some of the poorest countries worldwide. And so you will see the impact of what happened in the global economy, how that played out in many of these countries. So what happened and why? And in fact, Maria touched upon many of the points that I'm going to make. So when I get to those points, I'm just going to skip over them because you've dealt with it quite nicely. In fact, from my perspective, there were indeed three crises. There was the food, fuel, and then the global financial crisis. And this actually happened within a matter of, oh, you know, there is water. There's water coming down on the computer. Yeah, where's the water coming from?
Oh, you know what? There's a cup here. I wonder if it's...
Yeah. Okay, thanks.
Okay.
No, water and electronics don't mix. So there were three crises, right? And the reasons, as Maria touched upon, speculation by investors, poor investments, the national policies were insufficient. In particular, overseas, in many of the countries, again, they have grain reserves. And some of these grain reserves were insufficient to meet existing demands because of drought or flooding and so on. Combined with the increase, the food price crisis created problems in country. And then there was also conflict. In some places like Somalia, there was in fact conflict, a continuing need for food aid because Somalia, at least parts of Somalia, is largely a failed state, constant need for external food assistance. And the food price crisis, I don't know whether you recall the crisis, but corn and many other items, there was significant increase in the price of these commodities. And when you're talking about very poor people, it means a lot when there's a dramatic increase in the price of food. For example, in Ivory Coast, you can see the increase in the price of beef, a bag of corn. Corn is a staple meal in many, many parts of the world. In Zimbabwe, for example, mealie meal, if you don't eat mealie meal, you feel like you haven't eaten. And Zimbabwe was already experiencing its own set of crises. So when you have this kind of price increase, it spells trouble for the vast majority of the population. And of course, people reacted to these crises. If you can recall, if you go and look it up, you will see that there were riots, food riots in many, many countries worldwide. And what was the response of the government? Well, India and Brazil banned the export of certain food. Some countries were able to release food from the grain reserves. Panama, they subsidized the price of rice by buying high and then reselling low. And these had to be done because of the violence and the potential for political instability in many of these countries. Now, and what did this mean for the poor? In the World Bank reports, they're estimating that about 64 million, this figure fluctuates, you see 63, 65, but say around 64 million people fell into extreme poverty due to the financial crisis. But again, this had been building up with the food and the fuel crisis over time. And when I say extreme poverty, I'm talking about people who actually live on about $1.25, $1.50, maybe $2 a day. So this, again, very, very poor families. And many of these families spend between 40, 60, sometimes 80% of the household budget is spent on food. So just imagine if you were spending half of your income on food. Half of your budget you are spending on food, and then you see dramatic increases in the price of the food that you have to buy. You have your wife, you have your children, sometimes you may even have extended family members. How does that work for you to spend already a significant percentage of your income on food, and now the price of food has gone up? So what does that mean for you? Then the next crisis was the fuel crisis, and I think many of you can recall paying $4 or so for a gallon of gas. I don't know, I see a lot of young people here, but I imagine that most of you were driving at the time, so you probably recall that. Gas price did go up. This was in about 2008. It was about $160. And part of that was the assumption by speculators, of course, in oil, and the thinking that peak oil had arrived. And peak oil is the oil that comes out of the ground at the point where it is believed the total amount of oil reserves worldwide starts to decline. And so the thinking was that oil prices would just keep going up and up because peak oil had arrived. And so in Ivory Coast, $2 gas that's $2 a liter is about $8 a gallon. A liter, there's about 4 liters. It's not an exact conversion, but at $2 a liter, it's about $8 a gallon. So here there was already, gas, if you go overseas, I do that all the time, gas is very expensive in Europe and very expensive in developing countries. And so, when it goes up like this, it's a really dramatic increase. And so fuel is also used for fertilizer. And many of these countries, if you talk about the Sahel, where it's very barren, it's very arid, the soil is poor, fertilizer is really relied upon to supplement support the soil so that people can grow millet and the other crops that they grow. So an increase in fertilizer prices do impact the way farmers plant and what they're expecting to be able to harvest if they can't afford fertilizers. So public transportation for many poor people who already walk because they're just so poor, they can't afford public transportation. So it became unaffordable for many more people. And as a result, people had to walk, or they had to stop going to work, or just find different ways of transportation. As I mentioned, fertilizer increased, and in many places that I go, when I lived in Ethiopia, for example, power outage was a regular part of life. Many people have generators if you can afford it, because you won't go a week without the power going out. That's just the way life is. So when fuel price goes up, these governments then have to buy the fuel or the companies import the fuel, and then the prices go up. And so there just isn't enough to go around. So the power outages, which is a normal part of life, becomes even more frequent. And then the third is the financial crisis. And many of the banks and so on overseas, they're not very well integrated into the system, but nevertheless, this crisis had significant impact overseas. So, and Maria mentioned the various theories: surplus capital, speculation, inaccurate grading of mortgage-backed investments, lax regulatory environment, and then the behavior of individual consumers contributed to the crisis. Now, what did this mean for poor people? So on top of the food and the fuel crisis, here comes another one. And these three crises was over a span of about 4 years, say from 2006 to about 2009. So UNESCO estimated that there was a decline. Imagine if you get a 20% decline in your income, what would that mean to you? And these are already, as I said, poor people, $2 a day at that income level, and having a 20% decrease in their income. The number of the world's hungry increased, and then global foreign direct investments, FDI, that declined from about 1.7 million to 1.7 trillion to 1.2 trillion. And this meant that income fell in many of the countries, again, where we work, because no factories were not being built or not being expanded, roads were not being constructed. So, of course, it meant that people had less jobs, and so in national income declined as well as household income. And speaking of national income, commodities declined, and so these are some examples. Tea is a major export in Kenya, in Rwanda, Burundi. Coffee, a major export of many countries in Latin America, Ethiopia, other parts of the world. Copper, a major export of a country like Zambia. And so in Zambia, some of the mines were closed. I'm sure there were other problems, but the fact that there was a decline in price of 1/3 also contributed to the problem. And then, of course, if the mines close, and those mining jobs, by the way, are very lucrative, relatively well-paying jobs, and people migrate to Zambia, they migrate from surrounding areas so that they can get jobs in those mines. And so when the mines close, it means that people then have to go back either to from Zambia, if they're from Zambia, or else to whichever country they migrated from. And the unemployment rate in many of these countries, we're talking 40%, 50% unemployment rate in many of these countries. So when something like a mine closes, it is important in that local economy. And so, here it is again in the Central African Republic, because of a significant increase in diamond prices. And remember, I said that the demand for commodities declined in the rich countries, and buying a diamond is by and large a discretionary item. So if people in the US and Europe, Australia, and so on are losing income, you're not going to spend, or you will spend less money. So diamond would be one of the things that you would cross off your shopping list. And what did that mean? It meant that for the Central African Republic, national income declined by 50%. Because the export of diamond is a significant part of this economy. And many of these economies are very concentrated in a few areas. So in Zambia, the copper mining plays a significant part of the economy. In Kenya, export of tea, flowers, tourism is very important. So when one of those goes down, it really takes a significant part of the economy with it. And I just want to talk a little bit about Senegal, just to give you some of so you understand what the impact of these crises. This is a country. It's the westernmost part of sub-Saharan Africa. Of sub-Saharan Africa, actually the African continent, I should say. You can see the adult literacy rate, the unemployment rate, almost 50%. Almost 50%. And there's a huge company called La Compagnie Chimique, the Compagnie des Produits Chimiques, the chemical product company in Senegal. And that company is a major employer in Dakar, in the capital city. And they had financial problems because of the decline in the phosphates and so on that they exported, and they also laid people off. So again, in a country where the unemployment rate is already 48%, to have a major employer laying people off, creates problem in that economy. Tax revenue goes down because the company's revenue is going down. And you can see remittances plays a huge part, but then because of the financial crisis, I will talk about this later on in the second presentation. I'll talk a little bit more about remittances, but Senegal depends to a significant extent on remittances, as do many of these countries. Remittances make up a huge part of the GDP in these countries. And so when you have crises of this nature, the migrants are having financial problems overseas, less people are migrating, and so the remittances that's coming back begins to decline, and remittances do support a lot of the households in these countries. And so actually here we go, showing household expenditure and how much is spent on food, fuel, and then of course education and health. And when food and fuel increases, you can see the problem that it causes for people who are already quite poor. All right. And so, there were riots in Senegal. Cotton prices, cotton is also a major export in Senegal, and there was a decline in cotton prices. So here you have a poor country, a major employer letting people go and reducing operations. Senegal imports all its fuel, so fuel prices is going up. So again, a recipe for significant problems in Senegal. Reduced remittances and so on. And so overall, these three crises, it was very difficult for people to say, well, I'll be able to get food stamps, or I'll be able to get, other kinds of safety nets. I'll talk a little bit more about, these impact later on, but it's not that there are safety net programs. In fact, the World Bank estimated that 75% of the severely affected countries do not have the wherewithal to mount safety net programs. So there's no food stamp, there's no unemployment insurance, there isn't, public works. There aren't these types of programs for the poor and the very poor in these countries. And I must say, though, that some countries did benefit. Countries that were net food exporters did benefit somewhat from the increase in food prices, but most countries suffered. And then, of course, in terms of the rise in oil price, the temporary rise, because then when demand declined, oil price did drop significantly. So, but countries like Venezuela benefited somewhat, Nigeria benefited, but you can even wonder about that because there's so much graft and corruption in Nigeria. Even if the more income is flowing into the country, how people never really benefit. I mean, I've been to Nigeria and saw long lines for gas in a country that exports so much oil. But nevertheless, some countries did benefit from the run-up in some of these prices. But by and large, a lot of people suffered. A lot of people fell into poverty as a result of these three crises. And that's the end of my presentation. So thank you very much. And I should turn it over to Maria.
Thank you, Jared and Maria. We're now going to open it up to questions from you. So please stand up and try to speak loudly. We don't have microphones. We didn't expect such a great crowd, so this is wonderful. So please speak up loudly and tell us who you're raising your question to, Dr. Toyota or Ms. Bird. Okay. Please.
Yes, I have a question for Dr. Maria.
Maria, do you want to come up?
Pardon me?
No, I'm just asking the speakers to come up.
In your analysis, you were focusing on private saving and private investment. Now, do you think we might get a different picture if you had included government investment, government saving, or in this case, this saving? I'm thinking in terms of Ricardian equivalence and how that might work in the process too.
Right, I didn't put up the charts for government investment and government savings, but they're not a lot they're not very much better than the household savings and household investment numbers in particular. I mean, our public debt has increased dramatically in this time period that we've been talking about. And I don't want to say that the run-up in government debt itself contributed to the financial crisis. I think it will contribute to the resolution of this over time. I'm not sure that that is as much of an indicator, though, as the household debt accumulation problem.
Yes?
Yeah, I'd like to know, in regard to the domestic savings declining and the debt increasing, if that's not related to the fact that the U.S. wages have not kept abreast of inflation in over 35 years. And that, I think, number one, in order to mask that problem, American women went back to work, and then when that didn't take care of it, credit cards. So I would like to know what you think about U.S. wages not keeping abreast of inflation.
I don't know if that in itself was a contributing factor to the sort of the excesses that occurred. I wonder, I mean, now we're getting into the realm of sort of the psychological sectoral issues. I think that you are right that as a whole, wages have just not kept up over time, particularly for the middle class. But at the same time, a lot of our, and again, this is just speculation, I think our personal aspirations and our expectations have gone up. I remember when I used to have cable television, you would flip it on and there'd be HGTV, and apparently you were nobody unless you had granite countertops, and it just became part of the, a general rise in expectations. There was, by the way, an excellent documentary and book, I think, written about, it might have been 15 or 20 years ago at this point, called Affluenza. I think it's worth looking at that again. I think that's sort of indicative of what happens on a cyclical basis, right? Not just here, but around the world in a lot of places. They suffer from this particular aspirational disease. Yeah.
But I just want to say that the socioeconomic disparity in this country is so vast that still reflects the fact that middle-class wages haven't been increasing at
Yes.
We're getting a living wage, so to speak.
Right, and actually it's interesting because if you do actually break down the behaviors of people who are actually in a lower income brackets, they didn't take on debt in the same way the middle class did, and they're the ones who disproportionately suffered from the lack of increase in wages. So I'm hesitant to say that it was just the stagnation in wages that led to this problem, because we do see that income groups who were even worse off than the middle class, even from a relative perspective, didn't suffer from the same kinds of debt overhang that the middle class did.
Maybe in addition to that, in a recent New York Review of Books article by Jeff Madrick, and he was talking about the tremendous rise in inequality. It wasn't so much addressing wages going down, but the vast inequality that has grown tremendously, and the enormous salaries paid to CEOs being percentage-wise an astronomical number than they ever were before, and also in comparison to other countries. So if you look at it from that perspective and you talk about stagnation of wages, there's one area where wages did not remain stagnant in light of this. At the same time, this huge growth of inequality in our country, but also throughout the world. But it was mostly emphasizing that. So you can see if that, to use a trite term, trickle down, it would also affect the average wages, but it's all part of the product of this vast growth in income inequality in the United States, but also in other countries as well. I found that fascinating, his analysis.
I wanted to address this to Jared. You talked about the crises. How have they fueled conflict within these countries, or among these countries? Can you?
Well, there were the riots in as a result of the increase in the price of food. But they didn't, I wouldn't say that they fueled conflict per se, not that I was aware of. In Somalia, there was already conflict because Somalia has been a failed state ever since Siad Barre left, what was that, in the 80s, I think? He left, he was chased out of Somalia. Zimbabwe, they've been having a political crisis for the longest time with Robert Mugabe and all of those issues. In other places, in Sudan, that's a long-standing conflict. In Eastern Congo, that's also a long-standing conflict. So I wouldn't say that these three crises contributed to any particular crisis that I know of. Yes?
Are you optimistic at all?
Am I optimistic? Well, we've had really terrible times in history before. When I look at what's going on globally, you look at the genocide we've had in Cambodia. You look at what has happened, the history of repression and so on in sub-Saharan Africa, and you look at the Great Depression, and I guess yes, the answer is yes. I'm hopeful that people will be smart enough that we will find a way forward that is equitable, that really supports the common good, and that we will become better people, as a result. I mean, if you look even at this country, where at its founding, I certainly wouldn't be up here speaking. I'd be somebody's chattel, and many of the women in here would not be able to vote or to be chair of a political science department. So in the broader scheme of things, I am hopeful that we can get to a better place. I do think that there will be more economic turmoil that will be coming along. When you read and listen, it almost sounds as if the seeds of the next crisis is already planted and starting to grow. It seems as if the captains of industry are going back to their old ways of believing and behaving. So, but despite that, I am hopeful that human beings can become better and be more mindful of the common good. So yes, I am hopeful. Yeah, I am hopeful. I mean, I've been in places, just my own personal story. I've been in places where, I was in Liberia right after this huge attack on Monrovia, the capital city, by all these warlords, and to see that place. I mean, it's still a challenging place, but you have someone there, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, who's trying to make something of the place. So you have to be hopeful that the human condition will improve. And in our history, we've had long periods of conflict. In Europe, there was the 100 Years' War, and there have just been these times when that's been very challenging, but we have, with faith, gotten to a better place. So that's what I'm hopeful about. Yes.
I was interested in whether there was an effect of the financial crisis on aid flows, and if there was an effect, how was that?
On aid flows?
Yeah, the effect of the financial crisis on aid flows to developing countries, and how was that felt?
Well, aid flows declined because there is a commitment by several countries to give, I think it's like 1.1% or 0.2% of GDP. And so as GDP declined, then you have that amount of aid. You have aid going down because it's a percentage of a smaller whole. So yes, it did affect aid flows, and there was a decline.
What were the domestic consequences of this financial crisis? I mean, we heard from Africa, and I mean, that's sort of the economically most marginal, most underdeveloped part of the world. What were the consequences in other parts in Asia? Were they equally harmful, or were they comparable to what we experienced here in the U.S.?
Asia did great. It was the only region of the world that was growing robustly over the last couple of years, with the exception of Japan, which was hit sort of disproportionately hard by the financial crisis, given the fact that its own banks had not been involved in the same sort of subprime mess that the European and the American banks were in. There were some other factors in Japan. But other Asian countries did very, very well over the last few years, growing rapidly.
I understand that Sweden had a banking crisis similar to what had occurred here and what had occurred in Japan. And they nationalized the banks, and it took them about 3 years to recover.
Yeah.
And I think you said that they're not quite out of the woods in Japan now after 20 years.
Right.
What would have happened if we nationalized the banks?
What would have, sorry?
What would have happened if we had nationalized the banks?
Well, I don't know. I don't know what would have happened to us if we had nationalized the banks. For Sweden, it seemed like a good solution, but of course the scale of their problem was a little bit different from the scale of our problems today. There are actually multiple ways in which countries can try to resolve these issues. In Sweden's case, it was a temporary nationalization. This was in the early 1990s. In Japan, during the late 1990s, the Ministry of Finance forced a lot of bank mergers to occur, much in the way that we sort of orchestrated a few mergers with some of the banks that were failing. But they also, what they did was they created a Resolution Trust Corporation, which was involved in trying to get these bad loans off of the books. And to date, we haven't really done anything like that. We haven't created a particular agency that would sort of gather up all these bad assets, try to rehabilitate them, try to sell them off, and recoup some of that money. This was particularly successful in Japan. The problem is they waited so long to do any of this. We acted a lot faster in this country in trying to get a grip on it. But the issue of these subprime mortgages and these bad assets, which are still on the books as far as our banks are concerned, this hasn't been resolved. And sort of these stopgap measures like trying to, purchase Fannie Mae bonds or to put forth some sort of buyer's credit, first-time buyer's credit, it's really not been very successful. I would say just marginally successful at resolving these issues.
Maria, thanks for explaining the whole housing market part of this crisis. I know that's one area. Do you, not that you can foretell the future, but is there also danger with the student loan system that we have?
That's a really good question. I don't know. What aspect of it is worrisome to you?
Just the fact that so many people are taking out loans, similar to mortgages. Will there be that temptation for industries to gather all those loans up, put them all together,
Now,
buy them from these banks?
Yeah, I'm not sure that, I don't know whether this recent health care bill that was passed, which had a provision for reforming student loans, whether there was anything in it. I don't know if anyone's familiar with that.
There was, it's now the banks were the middle people. That's been taken out of the equation. All the money for loans will come from the government, which they came from anyway, but instead they went from the government to banks. Banks were taking commissions, et cetera, yada, yada, yada. This way it's much cheaper. I think 4 to 5 billion will be saved just by this process. Now the money was already government money, but it's going to be given directly rather than through the middle. So it should be better, safer, and more economical in the long run. And students will pay less interest.
And then two other provisions. One was that at the student loan that you pay is capped at a certain percentage of your income. And after, was it 20 years, whatever principal is left is forgone. And 10 years if you work in a nonprofit sector. So,
it's for the benefit of the students at this point.
So I think that.
So that sounds like good news for students, right? If you're putting a cap on fees and putting a cap on interest paid over time. Sounds like bad news for anybody who would want to repackage and invest.
Can I add something
Yeah.
to that? I think the original question touched on the similarity between student loans and mortgages. And to draw that analogy, if student loans market would get in the trouble that the mortgage market would require two things. The kind of leverage we had in the
Right.
mortgage market, and I think, people are to take out loans, and even if it's financing a large part of the cost, it's still not 90% or more of the ultimate value of that education. So you have a lot less leverage there. But the other thing, of course, that could trigger it is, just as housing prices started to fall, if the value of a college education were to fall, that would certainly endanger that market.
Exactly. That was what the point I wanted to make, in that with the current job market and the likelihood that we're in for something like a jobless recovery makes that prospect a riskier prospect.
I have a question about food prices. They've kind of moderated since 2008, but historically food prices were very low for maybe 30 years until maybe 5 years ago. Did that act as a disincentive to invest in poor countries in farming technology? And do you think that higher prices now will encourage more investment in farming and increase that technology so that these countries will be more sustainable?
Well, the increase in food prices was seen at some point as an opportunity for farmers because then they could get higher prices, especially farmers overseas, because many times they have to sell to the grain marketing board, and they get paid nothing despite what world market price for whatever the commodity is. So it was an opportunity, but a lot of the increase in food prices. The U.S. is a big donor of food overseas, and a lot of it is like maize, corn. We use a lot of corn in our food program overseas, but because a lot of the corn and some of the other products were going into biofuels, and Brazil was a big user of biofuel, the United States, several other places, and so that's where the demand was being pushed up for these kinds of products. So I think that there will be benefits on both sides, that potentially farmers could make more money, but then there are a whole lot of other people who don't have the wherewithal to purchase the food at a higher price anyway. So it has both positive and negative consequences, and governments have to think very carefully about how they go about addressing this problem and what kind of policies they put in place. It's not very cut and dried.
I was going to ask Dr. Toyota to speak more about the Asian financial crisis. I mean, the Asian countries and how they haven't been able to be affected by the financial crisis. Because it seems like, as an emerging market, you would want to follow the policies of the industrialized nations. And the IMF policies on the Asian countries pretty much tell them how to run it, so I was going to ask.
Yeah, not lately. But one of the reasons why Asia has been sort of relatively immune from this is that a lot of them put into policies that were really very well timed. China, in particular, put into place a very large stimulus package. And one of the things that you can look at that shows. One of the reasons why, say, China actually grew at a very rapid rate last year and in 2008 is that if you look at the rate of investment in China, if you look just, again at the figures from last year, most of that growth came from investment. Much less of that growth came from exports. So China was very successfully able to shift spending into investment for the moment. Right, and investment in infrastructure, investment in lots of things. We don't know whether this is going to lead to some bad consequence. In common with African countries, these commodity prices actually were increasing prior to the financial crisis. And a lot of the governments, particularly Vietnam, Laos and Cambodia and a few others very wisely took the windfall profits from this and started using them for stimulus measures. Yeah.
I have two questions. Domestically, who are the main purchasers of CDOs? And also, I think it's Norway that's now suffering the economic repercussions of having purchased CDOs. Like, what was the logic behind allowing foreign markets to invest in our housing, our domestic housing market?
Well, it's not just foreigners investing in it. In fact, it's a lot of institutional investors here, right here at home. You think about it, if you're a pension fund manager, or if you are a fund manager working with money that you really can't risk losing, right? You're looking for the safest instruments. But if you were to try and invest in things like U.S. Treasury bonds, you wouldn't be making any money. So the CDOs were sort of a new kind of investment that was made available from about the earliest ones maybe date back from the early 1990s, but really picked up in the late 1990s. They were a new product that was made available to meet the demand of these investors. And he figured that if they sliced these pools of assets, they could be anything, right? They could be mortgages, they could be other sorts of investments. That if they could do this and then differentiate which ones were the safest, so-called safest ones, and they would get credit ratings for them, and then be able to accordingly price the lower quality ones, that they could then meet that demand. But the demand was tremendous, right? The demand coming not just from these countries that have built up these massive foreign reserves, but even domestically from an increase in like pension funds and insurance companies and other sorts of funds that really can't take too much of a risk with people's savings. That was part of the growth of this industry. Of course, it was also pushed by an industry that benefited a great deal from it.
Thank you, Maria and Dorat. Before we close the session, I just want to make a few announcements. Is Lindsay Myers here? Lindsay, you're in the back somewhere? There you are, Lindsay. Some students, their professors have asked them to sign in. So I have a sign-in sheet, and there's Lindsay back there, and she'll have this. And if you need to sign in, please do. Secondly, I'd like to encourage you to attend some of the other sessions. They're every bit as good as this session today. At 2:30, there'll be a session, Is the Capitalist System Fundamentally Flawed? Alternative Models of Capitalism and Alternatives to Capitalism. Dr. Jean McCarraher and Dr. Zaleski will be giving that session. At 2:30, there will also be another session. The first session was in the St. David's room. At 2:30, in the Radnor room, Who is Bearing the Impact? Where, Why, and How? Dr. Eckstein and Ms. Bird. At 4 o'clock in the St. David's room, The Effectiveness of Social Safety Nets, Dr. Kreutzer and Ms. Bird. And we've changed the location of the second 4 o'clock session. It is now moved to the Bryn Mawr room, and it's What Ordinary Citizens Can Do, and that's Dr. Wilson and Ms. Candace Harris. Please do keep in mind this evening's plenary address going to be given by William Greider, The Next American Dream. Let me see what else. And I just want to, one last announcement, please keep your eyes open for an announcement on April 22nd, Earth Day. We will have another CRS Partnership sponsored event. And the title of that is Beyond Fair Trade, New Business Models, Agro-Enterprise, and Sustainability. There'll be 3 afternoon sessions. Again, they're going to be timed to coincide with classes. And each session will be geared to a different college in the university, business, engineering, and also arts and sciences. So I'd like to ask you to thank Ms. Bird and Professor Toyota for excellent presentation.